The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is arguably the most significant economic, social, and political event of recent history. Its significance results from its massive impact on all of those areas, on every country in the Western world in the 19th century and later the entire world. Its significance really can't be understated. Just some pointers what we'll look at today in the background to the Industrial Revolution. Basically, in a nutshell, what we are talking about when we talk about the Industrial Revolution is the movement to an economy based upon the mass production and distribution of goods. The movement within the economy from the production of goods within the home or the workshop to the factory. Most historians date the Industrial Revolution from about 1750 to 1900. I think this is a good time frame for looking at it, even though really there's two separate industrial revolutions, if you will, that take place during this time period. And while a revolution implies a fast change and abrupt change, and that's certainly true, I think it's important to note that in terms of industrialization, from 1750 until the early 19th century, 1800, 1825 even, change was relatively slow. But starting after or within the early 19th century to the 20th century, change was rather rapid. The transition to this mass production economy that happens in a factory kind of system was not an easy one, and the 19th century certainly bears that out. Ultimately, industrialization was good for most people and it was good for most countries, but this was a very, very difficult process, and it was a process that was incredibly costly. The Industrial Revolution began and spread the most quickly in Great Britain, followed secondly and followed very closely by the United States. Continental Europe lagged behind. So as we go through the background of the Industrial Revolution today, we'll talk about some of the reasons why England had a bit of a head start. Another thing to note is that the Industrial Revolution began in the textile industry. Textiles, of course, are cloth, any kind of cloth, and textiles are used to create a number of things, everything from clothing to drapes to linens for your bed, etc. It began in the textile industry. All right, now you need a few things. You need a few things before you can have an industrial revolution. You need cash or capital in an entrepreneurial class that has that cash or capital. You need a labor force, people to work in industry. You need strong and relevant natural resources to support your industry, and a government friendly to private property and private enterprise to allow industry to grow. In a nutshell, in the late 18th and 19th century, England possessed all of these things, and it's why they were able to industrialize first. One of the reasons, not that other countries in Europe did not possess them, but England possessed them more strongly in greater number, perhaps you can say. The most important thing, however, that you need before you can industrialize is food. All right, it's the most important thing that you need. Countries cannot industrialize successfully until they get over what I like to call the food hump. And that means that their food production has improved and become efficient enough that fewer and fewer people are needed to produce a quantity of food to sustain the country's population. And England in the 18th century did a very good job getting over their food hump and really significantly increased their agricultural production. If you will think back to last semester and the multiple choice we looked at pertaining to the 16th and 17th century, one of the very important social changes that we noted happened at that time was an increase in population. And that increase in population was directly related to a more abundant food supply, an increase in food. And that increase in food came from what historians call the agricultural revolution. Now, this took place all over Europe, not just in England. But again, if we're talking about relative success, England did this relatively well, and they did it relatively faster, perhaps, excuse me, than other places. So the agricultural revolution encompassed a couple of things. First of all, more efficient farming methods, better tools for the plowing of land, the transition in planting from a scattering method to a linear, bury the seed in the ground kind of method, the use of crop rotation to refresh the soil, etc. This vastly increased crop yields, and in England led to a movement called enclosure. Well, here's my slides in the wrong place here, so let me get ahead of myself. I'll talk about enclosure in just a moment. Now, during the agricultural revolution and during the 18th century, most production of textile goods, we have to remember, it's not like Europe was without textile goods or without furniture or without anything like that. But these goods were produced in shops, and textiles in particular were produced as part of cottage industry. Now, the cottage industry was also known as the putting out system, like pudding, P-U-T-T-I-N-G, and that literally came from the family, the cottage, putting out the work. Entrepreneurs, businessmen would pay families to produce textiles within their home. These were families that farmed, and they were probably tenant farmers to a larger landowner, maybe probably a member of the aristocracy, something like that. But you can see in this picture the pictures of the family, particularly the women of the family at work in cottage industry. Here is a woman operating a spindle, a spinner. Here's another one. They're creating thread and yarn out of wool. And she's also over here doing some spinning. This picture doesn't demonstrate a loom, but families also possessed looms with which they could weave the yarn and wool into pieces of cloth. And so the family, and mostly the women, did this to supplement the income that the family gained from the production of goods in agriculture. Now, the agricultural revolution, because of the need to rotate crops and because of the more scientific approach to the production of food, led in England most predominantly to a movement that occurred over the course of the 18th century, over the course of the 1700s, to something called enclosure. And enclosure was literally the fencing off of private lands. And the reason people enclosed their lands in the 18th century was to use that land more purposefully, let's say. Well, enclosure had a huge impact in England because for centuries and centuries, in English villages, you probably had a few dominant landowners. One would be a member of the aristocracy, and that land, people rented houses on it, they used it, people did subsistence farming. They might live in the village and use open land or common land, as it was called, to plant a small garden or crops to keep a cow or a pig or some other kind of livestock. Well, enclosure led to the closing and the elimination of these common lands. It led to members of the peasantry essentially being kicked off of their land, being forced out of subsistence agriculture. And so while enclosure was beneficial to the landowners because it increased their wealth, and it was beneficial to the country as a whole because it had a positive impact on overall food production, you had a very unfortunate subset of the population that was very negatively affected, that literally found themselves with no home, with nothing to do. Now, these are the people who became the labor force for industry. The Industrial Revolution started with a demand, with a very high demand for a very low skill labor force. And England, because of industrialization, and not industrialization, because of enclosure, had this abundant, ready to go labor force, became an important part of their ability to industrialize in the 18th century really rather quickly. England also had a significant entrepreneurial class ready to put these people to work. Now, cottage industry of the 18th century had produced this entrepreneurial class. In England, capitalism and laissez-faire had been more strongly embraced in the 18th century than they had been in continental Europe. And England had this class of people who had cash to put into the development of new technology and into the formation of industries, and people who were willing to take the risk to do that. It's a risky thing. One of the reasons that England had a rather significant entrepreneurial class in the 18th and 19th century was because the practice of primogeniture was still legal and prevalent in England. In continental Europe, especially in France and other places like that, they had moved away from primogeniture. Primogeniture is the legal and official practice of favoring the eldest son, and primogeniture is a very complicated thing, but for our purposes here, it simply means that the eldest son inherits everything. And so if you weren't the eldest son in a wealthy family, in an aristocratic family, it didn't mean that you were going to be tossed out on your tush and you were going to be without any kind of financial resources. It just meant that your big brother was going to inherit all the land, and if you were an aristocrat, was going to inherit the title. And those things were not divided amongst all the sons in an aristocratic family. So second sons and third sons and fourth sons and on down the line, they had to find something else to do. And so these were the men who became great explorers or settled the New World, or they joined the church, or they became officers in the army, or they became entrepreneurs in industry. Okay, they became entrepreneurs in industry. It was uncouth in the 17th and 18th century for a gentleman to work. But if you weren't the inheriting son, you had to work. And so they did. So any of you out there who are younger brothers, or maybe you're the eldest brother. So Robert, I'm going to use you as an example because I know that you have an older brother. Robert has an older brother, Lucky, and he has a younger brother, Daniel, and he also has a sister, Elizabeth. And so if we had primogeniture, and if Robert's family was part of the landed aristocracy, Lucky would be the only child able to inherit the lands and titles. And so Robert and his other younger brother would need to find things to do. And so they'd be excellent, perhaps, members of this entrepreneurial class that to go out and make their money in industry or in the army or something like that. Girls, as you can imagine, what the daughter has to do here is make a good marriage. Of course, that is still what women needed to do at this time, but the continuing practice of primogeniture in England really enhanced their entrepreneurial class. And like I said, especially in France, they gave up primogeniture because it was so unequal, right, and want to favor people. But it really kind of limited or slowed down the growth of an entrepreneurial class in other places in Europe. And finally, you can't industrialize unless you have technology. Do you remember on our little activity we did with Napoleon's decision making? He turned down an offer from an American inventor to produce steamships for him. Well, it just turns out that the very first steam engine was invented by James Watt, a Scotsman. in the 1760s, there was another American, Robert Fulton, who was another important inventor and developed a steam engine as well. But what the steam engine did essentially was it took water and coal and it used heated the water to build up steam, which would then turn an engine, turn a machine. The steam engine was perhaps the most important invention of the Industrial Revolution. Everything depended on it. Everything in the 18th and 19th century had a steam engine. Without the steam engine, you could not have the mechanization necessary for the development of the factory system. Without the steam engine, you didn't have a railroad, you didn't have a steamship, you didn't have any of those things. So it was an incredibly important advancement of the time period. It led to the mechanization necessary for the creation of industry, for the creation of the factory system. So England had technology and they had some pretty smart people and they had a labor force and they had an entrepreneurial class and they had a government that stayed out of the way of all of these things. They just didn't get involved and didn't get in the way of the development of this stuff. And so in the late 18th century, there were the developments of textile making equipment that used the steam engine to make the machines go, if you will. So the steam engine is the engine, and then you have these other machines that operated using a steam engine. And one of the first and most important inventions in this class of inventions was the power loom. The power loom was a great big machine that wove textiles, something that in cottage industry, a man or a woman would sit in their house and operate with their hands and feet on a very small scale. And the power loom could produce textiles much more quickly and in much higher quantity. The power loom led to the mechanization of the spinning process, something called a spinning jenny, because it created a demand for ever greater amounts of yarn and thread. And so that secondly became mechanized. And as we'll see, this led to the creation of a work situation where great big mechanized machines were housed in buildings called factories, and the workers came to the machine. England also possessed the raw materials and resources necessary to make good use out of the steam engine and the power looms and the spinning jennies and the other machines that supported the increased production of textiles. Lots of sheep and therefore lots of wool production in England and Scotland and the greater Great Britain. They have lots of rivers and canals and water, which was incredibly important in early industrialization. In fact, all early factories had to be built on a river or on a water source. They needed the water to make the steam engines work. And England has lots of coal made. So you burn the coal to make the steam. England had lots of coal, and so they had all the natural resources, the entrepreneurs, the friendly government, the labor force, and a sufficient food supply because they had jumped their food hump. And therefore, England became the first country in the world to successfully industrialize.